Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and thank you so much for being with us here on the program. We are here to bring you new paradigms for a new world, choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m. That's our special edition of Tell Me Your Story. And then Monday through Friday, from 8 to 9 a.m., 9 programs, 9 topics, 9 different conversations. We hope that you will join us for all of them, or at least some of them. We stream live at those times at richarddugan.com, and we podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and many other locations, as well as YouTube, where you can watch these conversations. We hope you'll subscribe, and then, of course, click notifications so that when I post a new conversation, you'll be notified and you can tune in and listen in and hopefully be entertained, be inspired, maybe even be educated a little bit on some of the subject matter from our guests' perspective. And we're looking forward to that today. We also ask that if you can support the work we're doing financially, we have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. And when they ask you to whom you are sending the support, it's richard@richarddugan.com. That's the email address you want to put in, richard@richarddugan.com. And also take some time to spend during this decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, going within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place and listening to that still, small voice. Well, today we're going to dive into a little history that has brought us to the present day, because we're going to talk with a very special guest who has written one of 3 books. The book we're going to focus on mainly is Reflecting on History, How the Industrial Revolution Created Our Way of Life, authored by, he is from Australia originally, back in 1939, came here. His name, Austria, I beg your pardon, misread that. Different direction, different hemisphere. Austria. And Peter Spitz is my guest. Peter, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and I certainly am very much impressed by the things you're talking about. So we'll have to look at that at some other time.
Yeah, we will indeed. But one of the things that is so intriguing, of course, I'm sure you're familiar. We will not go in depth into this, just as a point of reference, that there were a lot of people who are very critical right now of how we got where we are. Well, from, I'm sure, your perspective as well as mine, well, folks, we're here. What are you going to do about it? Okay? You can't change it. History is what it is. And my biggest concern over history and the learning of it is the fact that we're unwilling to teach the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history. And yet there's a lot of good. What is it about the Industrial Revolution, from your perspective, Peter, that is so intriguing that you chose to take a look at this in a manner of speaking, I guess, from the perspective that, well, here we are. We kind of know how we got here, i.e. the Industrial Revolution, but it seems to me like there's a whole lot more to that story that you talk about in your book.
Well, first of all, the Industrial Revolution is really a starting point for a lot of things that happened in the world. And it's a useful place to start is around 1700 in England, when a lot of things were happening that would promote invention. It would promote changes in living standards, and it would also elevate England as being a much more important country as far as industry is concerned. And so what made me interested in the subject is because while my almost complete background professionally, and even going back to my education, is in technology, and particularly in the energy part of technology, and in chemistry, which I was very interested in high school already, which led me to work for a couple of large companies that were involved in those areas, and eventually to start my own company, which became a very well-known consulting firm with 200 people and offices in several countries. Now, the first books that I wrote, I started reading in writing in 1980s, was the history of the petrochemical industry. That was the first book. And then I wrote another book about 10 years later about the state of the chemical industry at the year 2000. Then I wrote another book, which also was about chemicals and energy. And then as I got into retirement, I started thinking, all right, enough with chemistry per se, we like that. I need something else to get really interested in. Because I already had seven patents in the chemical and energy areas, so I was an inventor in certain areas. I said, well, inventions per se are really interesting. And I really could write a book about inventions, but I need to have some kind of a handle. Even when thinking about the Industrial Revolution, you go to the library and there are 100 books about the Industrial Revolution. So that doesn't appeal to me as to be the 101st book. So I said, no, I need some kind of a handle, some kind of a way to make this a different kind of book that would be of interest beyond just all the inventions themselves. So I thought one of the ways to looking at it is, how do these various inventions that took place between 1700 and the present time influence our way of life? Have people thought about it at all? And when they do enjoy the fruits of civilization, as some people call them, ranging from things like, let's say, not just automobiles and television sets and so forth, but refrigeration and microwave ovens and antibiotics and glass, plate glass, and all these things that we enjoy and make our life better in many respects. That do have some drawbacks, but I'll leave those for a different discussion. I said, maybe I could write a book that basically explains to people how these inventions came about, not just that they happened and who were the famous people who invented, people like Edison or other people of that kind, Morse with the Morse code, or Arthur Fleming of penicillin, but also to explain the invention itself in a fairly short way and in a way that people can understand it, even if they don't have a very extensive scientific background. So, I mean, how many people really know what happens when you plug in a lamp and the electricity starts flowing? How is electricity created? I'll bet you there are very few people who go through with that question who give you a good answer about that. When they heat their home with natural gas, they know that when they open the a valve somewhere, that natural gas starts flowing, and you can use it for cooking or heating your house. How does it get here, and how long have we had it? Because if you go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people heated things with wood. It's about the only way you could heat something, except maybe by sunlight. So all of a sudden now, 200 or plus years later, we use natural gas and we don't even think about it. There must be some way to explain how you got from A to B. And the same is true for many, many other things. We look at our window and you see glass. There was no glass like that 200 years ago. How did it come about that we now make these huge sheets of plate glass that we actually use as construction materials? There is technology behind that, and there are inventors behind that. And I thought, people with intellectual curiosity would be interested not only that there was a person that invented the way to generate electricity, but also how did it all happen, and what kind of people would look at what was known at the time that they started thinking about it, and what could they do about it to advance the technology. And the amazing thing is that there's a lot of commonality in how these things happen with many people. In some cases, there was an individual inventor, like Marconi and radio, or there were several people who were all inventors who contributed to the construction and use and of a computer, which was something obviously completely unknown even 100 years ago. So that sounds like a really interesting subject, and I ended up with a book that described 25 inventions, not only who and what, but also what can people think about when they use a microwave oven? Do they think about where does the heat come from? There's no fuel there. There must be some way to heating, but it seems kind of uncanny. And when the microwave oven came about, the housewives were scared of this thing. They couldn't understand how you could have an oven without any fuel there. Obviously knew there was electricity must have something to do with it because they plugged it in, but little could they possibly know about the fact that the microwave oven actually had its birth in the Blitz of London when one of the Raytheon, that's a defense contractor, one of the Raytheon people shooting down Luftwaffe airplanes accidentally pointed his radar gun at his pocket and melted a candy bar, and they started thinking about that. There must be something going on here with this so-called magnetron that causes something to heat. And the more he thought about it, he said, I've got to try this thing out. So he next day came in with an egg and aimed the gun at the egg, and the egg exploded. And one of his contemporaries saw this and said, this must be a way that we can heat something that nobody knows anything about yet. Let's think about how we could make this, could be commercialized. And 20 years later, we had a microwave oven.
And it's even had some innovations, because in the very beginning, if I'm not mistaken, and for quite a long time, you could not put anything metal or metallic into it, or it would create all kinds of sparks and potentially catch fire or explode. I'm not sure we have moved forward here in the 21st century to where that's not as big of an issue, but I know that that these are the kinds of things that take place. And when we talk, for example, with the Industrial Revolution and so forth, and we talk about innovation, when I think about some of the innovations that we have had over the years, Peter, I think that they are not like using the automobile at the turn of the century, as well as what we use today in terms of the smartphone / computer. I mean, they say that my smartphone, my Android phone, has enough power in it, technologically, that I could hook this into a Johnson Space Center and I could launch a rocket by comparison to all the computers that they used to have. But we're still doing exactly the same thing that we were doing before the cell phone and before the automobile. With the cell phone and before the telephone and the telegraph and so forth, we were still communicating. It just took longer. With the automobile, before it, we were in the horse and buggy, and in many instances, we would walk. And it just took a little longer, but we're still doing exactly the same things. It's just made it a little faster, a little more efficient and so forth. And I think too, in that regards, now that we're here in the 21st century and we have all these innovations and people are concerned about our environment and so forth, it seems to me that that's also where innovation is going to come in. I mean, there's a young man that I read about 10, 12 years ago, I think, from Europe. I want to say the Netherlands, who developed this device, this huge ocean-going device that has been modified over the years that is helping to collect, for example, a lot of the garbage that's in the ocean around those, for example, those they call them the big gyres in terms of what's being tossed into the waters. So there's innovation. There is, we're thinking, okay, how can I make the world a better place? All right, I'll develop this machine, this device, this floating collection device. And then, of course, she thinks to the next level. Okay, so now that I've got all this stuff collected, now what do I do with it? I mean, putting in the landfill seems a little, I might as well toss it back in the ocean, kind of thing. So he came up with a way of processing it, and they use it in some instances, like for insulation in homes. So again, it seems to me as though the Industrial Revolution, okay, we could take a look at the unintended consequences, but the reality is, as man evolves, does he not innovate to make his world a better place? I talk to people about climate change, and I say, I don't want to talk to you about the science. We just need to clean up our home. Could we just clean up our home? And this young man came up with a way to start doing that. What are your thoughts in that regard when we start seeing things that we feel like we need to do, like back at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, getting from point A to B a little faster, or being able to communicate with you instantaneously, like here we are on Zoom, as opposed to here, I'll write you a letter with questions and you can respond to it and then send it back to me. And that could take a couple of months based upon maybe using the Pony Express and so forth. What are your thoughts?
I would certainly do that if you. I'd be very happy to respond to that. And that's a challenge.
I love it. I love it. Yes. What are your thoughts, though, in that regard? Do you think that people are a little too critical? They're too consumed by, and that they need to take a look and say, look, if you see a problem, if you see an issue, a challenge, then come up with a solution.
Well, I tell you something. You mentioned climate change, and that leads me to make a comment that I think you're going to find interesting. Obviously, most people with any sense, with any background, probably ended up agreeing that putting carbon into the atmosphere has some negative effects on the climate. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that that's true, because probably the majority of people think it's true. Now that then says, all right, I'm going to do something about this. What can I do? Well, obviously, one of the things you can do is to use less fuel. If you burn less coal or oil or gas or whatever it is, you're going to throw less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? Now, if you therefore start developing some technology that you can create energy without burning fuels, I'm talking about wind turbines and solar cells, that would be one way of getting less carbon. But there's another way we can do it. Maybe we can just grab that carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere that's been pushed in the atmosphere and absorb it somehow and get rid of it, or at least lessen it. Because if you have less carbon up there, you're going to have less of a problem of the heat being trapped underneath it, and you get global warming. And this led to an unbelievable consequence, which is that people said, we have to develop some way to catch this carbon. And this launched a huge industry just getting going now, trapping carbon in some way. We knew how to do it. The question is, do we want to do it? Because it's extremely expensive to do that. You have to build some very complicated equipment and then use a solution of so-called amines, which is like a a basic material that absorbs carbon and makes a solid carbonate out of it, which can then be transported 1,000 miles somewhere and buried somewhere in the Rockies. Now, the amount of money that is being spent on what's called carbon capture is unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
So large that you could hardly. One example is that Exxon and Occidental Petroleum are being paid between $60 and $100 per ton of every carbon dioxide that they can trap and transform into a solid material and then transport it somewhere and bury it. The amount of money that's being spent for that is incredible. What is not being realized by people who do the math is that the amount of carbon that is about to be captured with a huge amount of investment is far, far less than it's being put into the atmosphere. So the math says that this is a huge expense that barely improves the situation. And neither Congress nor administration and so forth seem to understand this math, so they continue to invest in carbon capture with more and more emphasis being done now, not just in capturing it at the source, but in somehow blowing air through screens so that some carbon dioxide is being captured on these screens, which would then be converted and shipped somewhere. So I think this proves the fact that you shouldn't always go ahead and do something because it looks like it's a good idea, but you should be intelligent about it and say, is this something we really need to do? Let's calculate and let's get rid of or not get rid of, let's tell the sponsors of these investments, which are going to be made in their states and create a lot of jobs, that this is really a stupid thing to do. There must be different ways of tackling this problem.
Well, Peter Spitz is my guest here on the program. We're talking about, yes, the Industrial Revolution and so forth, as well as talking about how the Industrial Revolution created our way of life, which it certainly did. We are living the way that we are living because of all of the innovations. And I think about that. One of the things that we talk about on this program is giving people choices and knowledge of those choices to help make their dreams come true. And a lot of people don't know, number one, that they have choices. Number two, even if they know they have choices, they don't know what choices they have. And that's why we're doing this program, to give them choices. And over the centuries, and I'll just use the last 150 to 200 years, I would not be here talking with you, in addition to the thousands of people who I owe a debt of gratitude for over the last 45 years doing what I do. I owe a debt of gratitude to maybe the millions of people over the last century or two, and then some, who have innovated technology. And I find it funny when I watch documentaries about the caveman, and they will then use the word technology in the context of describing the tools that the caveman created. And I suppose it's accurate to a degree, but I've never considered a rock or a stone or what have you to be technologically associated. But be that as it may, I'm curious, you being in your 90s, and my father was the same way. I mean, he was born in 1931, and he went through the Depression and World War II and all of that stuff. And he has seen and was very much intrigued specifically by computers. He in the 70s, he went to junior college to get his computer programming degree. And of course, back then, they used fanfold paper and punch cards, which we loved as kids because it gave us lots of paper to draw on. And then in the 90s, when I was introduced to the computer for the first time, I started learning how to build them. Primarily getting a tower and then getting the motherboard and the peripherals and the power supply, and I could put them together. I had a blast doing that. Can't do that quite as much today with the newer, because everything is pretty much integrated. I'm curious from your perspective. I want to throw one other thing in here: televisions. Do you remember? I'm sure you've seen the the evolution of televisions. There was a time when they were very small, and of course we go to black and white, but we'll stick with the color, the current era. And they were very small, and then they started to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the smartphone came along.
Oh, wait, let me interrupt you for a moment.
Sure.
You not only say bigger and bigger, but thinner and
I,
thinner. And I want to talk about that later.
yes, absolutely. So now I have an Android S20, and I don't know the exact measurements, but nonetheless, I watch a lot of videos on it. Sometimes while my wife and I are watching at the same time, Netflix on our 58-inch TV screen up on the shelf, overlooking the bed, and so on and so forth. And it's like we keep going back and forth between big and small, especially with televisions. Cars are kind of the same thing. We went into the small end, especially during the 70s and early 80s. Then we went to SUVs, real big cars. And now I drive a Volkswagen, and they refer to the Tiguan, it's a 2020. They refer to it as a compact SUV. Those to me, that's like military intelligence. They're diametrically opposed. They're mutually exclusive terms. An
It's a
SUV to me is big.
it's a contradiction in terms,
Ex-
actually.
exactly. But what do you see coming down the road in terms of our not just our technology, whether it's cars or phones, what have you, but in terms of, I guess we could throw in there AI and how that's going to not only change how we work and where we work, but what we do at work if some of us don't even work at all.
Well,
I know that's a
AI,
lot.
it's interesting because artificial intelligence, the term itself, has been around for quite a while. In fact, one of our kids went to Michigan and transferred to MIT because MIT had an artificial intelligence program, and that was in I guess, in the late 1970s or something like that. So that's about 50 years ago. So it took about 50 years before AI became what it is right now, which is an unbelievable breakthrough, which could have probably been predicted because all AI really is, to me, is a huge capability of data mining and putting all that stuff together as a person would in their head, except AI does it in a machine with machine learning. Now, if you're asking what is going to be the next breakthrough, if that's one of the questions you're
Hmm.
posing, I really don't know. One thing that bothers me somewhat, or think about somewhat, is the fact that I do believe, and my belief has been very much strengthened by this tremendous heat wave we're experiencing right now.
Hmm.
It's pretty much a fact that we have this global warming, that the ocean levels are going to start rising, and that we're going to have to do something about this. And I think so-called abatement, as they call it, of the problems caused by global warming, which means flooding of harbors, flooding of islands, having a problem with people having to live with much higher and higher temperature. I think there's going to be some innovation in that area because we're going to have to do something about that. And instead of throwing trillions of dollars into what I talked about, this carbon dioxide capture,
Hmm.
or even putting solar cells all over the place, so there's no room for farming anymore with all the solar cells that we have on the ground. Uh, we're going to have to figure out a way to live with global warming, and I think that's going to sponsor a lot of innovation of how to do that at a cost that we can afford. We may have to move, many millions or maybe tens of millions of people to higher ground in order to get to keep them alive in order to let them live a normal life. So that's an area where innovation, I think it could really make a big difference if some clever people start addressing this problem.
Yeah. Well, of course, my first thought was, okay, let's not use the land. What we can do is we can develop large solar panels and we can launch them into orbit around the Earth to capture and then send the energy down like we do with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and we can do it that way. The only problem with that is there is so much junk in outer space surrounding the Earth. I co-host a program with a gentleman by the name of Steve Cates, Dr. Sky, and we talk about the realms of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather. And one of the programs talked about the junk that is orbiting the Earth. And there's a website you can go to, and you can actually see it in its density, especially around the equator, and that how dangerous it is becoming to launch anything without taking into consideration something you might hit or that might hit you, and so forth. So on the surface, sounds like a great idea to put solar panels maybe over the poles or something like that to capture the energy and then transmit it to Earth. But what are the risks of damaging and so forth? I mean, look at the Hubble and the James Webb telescopes with their massive mirrors and solar panels and so forth that have to be unfolded, and the risks of things flying through outer space that could damage them. So but that's the wonderful thing, I think, Peter, about the human spirit is its willingness to consider. There are not everybody, but many to consider the possibilities when it comes to inventions or inventing. And you have some of your own inventions. That takes, from my perspective, an individual who is willing to think outside the box, who is willing to tap into the inspirational energies that exist, and also recognize, if I'm not mistaken, because there is nothing new under the sun. As I said before, the automobile is nothing more than a means to transport from one place to the other. But they're willing to consider the impossible as possible. I mean, if it weren't for Jules Verne's and his book, would we have, I think about this, would we have ever gone to the moon?
Well, the invention of solar panels up there in space is interesting. Probably, if one look at that seriously and think about the fact that there are all these countries and all these administrations and all these politics and so forth, to find a way of doing this thing that would make sense, that could be afforded, sort of boggles the mind. So, but that doesn't mean people shouldn't think about it. I thought you were going to mention the other thing up in space, possibly, which is called geoengineering. I think you've heard about that.
Yeah.
That is a possibly more realistic thing to do. I'll just mention the fact that global warming ceased for a short period of time a couple of decades ago when a volcano erupted and threw a lot of sulfur particles into the atmosphere. And those sulfur particles shielded the Earth from some of the from sunlight and reduced global warming measurably for a certain period of time. And therefore, scientists began to think, if we shot a lot of sulfur particles in the form of sulfuric acid up into the atmosphere all over the globe, you could halt or at least abate global warming considerably. And that sounds even less fantastical than the idea that you're putting solar cells up there. One thing, you don't have to worry about the object in space at that point.
True.
And so geoengineering is a possibility. The trouble is you have to keep doing it forever
Yeah,
because the sun's going to be there and the earth's going to be there. And you may run out of sulfuric acid at some point to
you very
throw
well
it
could.
there. But these are some of the things that people think about. And I think what you should, and you're thinking, as I'm sure you have to some extent, consider the kind of things coming out of the US government by an agency called DARPA, which is part of the Defense Department. Are you familiar with it?
I've
Probably.
heard the term. I've heard the
Well, I
department.
think it's
Yeah.
very much worth your while. DARPA is funded by the DOE, Department of Energy, and is probably most certainly responsible for a lot of the technology that we know. He was using space and in computers in another area. And in DARPA, they hire people who think outside the box and come up with some really amazing things. So I urge you to get more familiar with it. I belong to a literary club in New York, and we had a speaker who gave us a background of DARPA, and it became so
Mm.
fascinating, and I've been sort of thinking about it and reading about it ever since.
Let me ask you, because you mentioned MIT, and you, of course, you speak there obviously often, I'm sure, and meet and talk with folks who are very intelligent. And I'm curious as to your perspective on one aspect of the inventing aspects of not just the United States, but the globe in terms of humanity. But let's take a look at the United States. There are extreme criticisms of our educational system. As a matter of fact, I remember in the late 70s, I got out of high school and I was taking 6 months off just because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I got to thinking about this because I'd heard this criticism about the textbooks and that the textbooks were not that great. And yet I thought, okay, well, let's process this. Okay, if the textbooks that I grew up with and I was educated with weren't that great, and let's just say for the sake of argument that I go into the textbook creating business based upon what I learned from those alleged inferior textbooks, I'm going to create not greater textbooks, but maybe even more inferior textbooks that other kids will learn from. They will go into the textbook industry and they will develop more and more. And in other words, the slippery slope, the quality of textbooks goes down and down and down, i.e., the education. And there's a rather interesting movie. I don't know if you've seen it or ever heard of it. It's called Idiocracy.
No, I don't know.
It's available on Netflix. I recommend it to everyone. It is a combination of funny and scary as hell because it's not a horror movie either. Because it basically takes place in the year 2525. No connection with the song, I don't think, but basically shows the decline of civilization. You have these giant monster garbage piles. You have buildings, high-rise buildings that went straight up. Let's say it's a 100-story building, went straight up for 50 floors. Then all of the sudden, they start zigzagging up. They're still building it, but zigzagging up because the people who were building them had no clue as to what the hell they were doing. Um,
What's the name of that Netflix
it's
show?
it's called Idiocracy. Idiocracy.
Idiocracy.
Yeah, and I recommend it only because there are aspects of it that I look at and I say, we are here now already. But I want to get back to my point in terms of our educational system and inventors. Now, do we really have intelligent people in places like MIT, what are considered the higher levels of learning? Um, or do you see, or are we being fed a lie that our educational system really isn't as bad as we're being told, and that we are actually educating people in such a way that we will continue to innovate, we will continue to progress and evolve?
Well, one thing I would counter is the fact, or mention at least, that I think there are a lot of problems with the U.S. educational system, and I would agree with that, although I hadn't really been that close to it. But that seems to be the consensus that several or a number of other countries do a better job of educating students, both at the primary level and also at the advanced level. But the thing about MIT is the fact that its student population is extremely mixed and probably has far more than 50% of their students come from the U.S. I would guess probably more like 60 or 70% of the people are not from the U.S. So we're getting benefit of the educational system of all the countries, including China and India and obviously the European countries and so forth. So in that respect, I think MIT is fortunate in attracting the brightest people, and I think that's a good thing. Is there a better way of doing it? Or, I really couldn't tell you.
Mm. I know one of the biggest issues when it comes to inventions and innovation and so forth, and of course, I wasn't alive at the time that the automobile came on the scene, but I would have to believe that the horse and buggy industry was none too happy with the automobile because it infringed on their supposed monopoly on transportation, including horse breeders as well, because a lot of folks would ride horseback from point A to point B. And a lot of people now want to get rid of the internal combustion engine. I don't know about you, but as far as transportation, if I was ever to switch, at least in the short term for the next 40 years or so, I would not go to an all electric vehicle. I would go to a hybrid that uses both
Exactly,
gasoline. Yeah,
exactly the same. I feel that
yeah,
100% is true. One thing I want to inject is the
sure.
fact that when some of the inventions came about, you mentioned the horse and buggy and the automobile, there was a huge negative push to get rid of these things. And in England, they made some kind of obstructions or flags or whatever it is in order to try to keep automobiles off the road because they're putting the horse and buggy out of business. Um, and in the British textile industry, and this comes out of the Industrial Revolution, um, what happened was that the invention of the steam engine and the fact that cheap cotton was available from the United States, those two things together created the British textile industry, and the machinery that was invented in order to spin these textiles in a way that much better than was being done in India, which was a country that dominated textiles before.
Hmm.
That was putting a huge number of cottage industry people who were making textiles in England by hand, with women spinning the yarns and the men providing power by cracking some kind of a thing. Uh, there was a revolutionary guy in England whose first name was Ludd, L-U-D-D, and he started a movement there in order to destroy these textile machines, which are putting people out of business. And the term Luddites is now survived as for somebody who is against new technology, and you probably didn't know that.
No, I've heard the term, but I did not know where that came from. But this is one of the things that it perplexes me. We want to innovate and we want to create new things, and obviously, this a lot of times nowadays, of course, it's all about the money. How if I can just change the color of this knob and then sell it again as an innovation and make more money, or during the heyday of upgrades of software back in the late 90s and early 2000s, constantly they were upgrading software, whether it was my recording and editing software or my word processor software. All they did was change the color of a button and called it an update. And it's like, cut it out. But change, which is the constant of the universe, is something that we, not only as human beings in general, have a really hard time with when it comes to moving forward. Because I don't know about you, I'm hoping you live long enough to see this day, but um, one of these days, we will not be whether it's by law or just by innovation, we won't be driving or transporting from one point to another via internal combustion engines, and that we won't be producing containers that are made of plastic. We will find something else that is better than plastic. And I'm not saying plastic is bad by any means, but look at the garbage we've got in our oceans, and that's
Absolutely.
a side effect. What are your thoughts in that regard? How do you, in your conversations with people, if you've gone in this direction, how do you address the subject of change, the fact that things are going to change? REM had a wonderful line in one of their songs. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I'm even 5 minutes ago, I can't go back 5 minutes to the world that was, because it doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people want to go back to the 50s and live under that kind of values and morals. You can't go back. How do you teach that? How do you inspire people to accept change in that regard?
You know, I'm sorry, I have to call you back, Missy. Thanks for the call.
That's all right. Go ahead.
That was my insurance agent. Well, first of all, I think you yourself would appreciate that at this point in my life, retired for a number of years, living at home, still having some connections to technology. For example, I'm very heavily involved in something called the Science History Institute in Philadelphia and so forth. And I do get involved a little bit in schools as well. I gave a six uh, six course lecture on global warming mitigation at Westchester Community College about a year ago. Um, but having said all that, unfortunately, I am not in a position to really either influence things, unless maybe my book does a little bit of that, or try to figure out how the really good professors deal with teaching how to do something about change. And I must admit, I haven't thought about that a great deal in that sense, but I think it is a very worthwhile objective that I would support very strongly.
Mm. Well, another method of innovation, which you can't really count on it because you don't know when it's going to happen. But we've had a couple of very interesting elements to our society, our consumer society, over the years. One in particular was Post-its. That was an accident. And whiteout, if I'm not mistaken, was also an accident. And those are two things that are very popular today. Well, they used to be popular.
You know,
Post-its are still,
I
but
know
what?
that Post-its is one of the 25 chapters in my book.
Yeah. And it came about by accident. As a matter of fact, I'm even going to throw this one in there, okay, from the pharmaceutical industry, that Viagra was originally designed as a high blood pressure medication. Of course, we all pretty much know what it's for now, ED. Um, so we have, of course, I didn't even know that was an issue until the pill came along. But again, you can't count on accidental innovation to bring us new innovations in our technology and our lifestyle and the way we live.
Can't count on it, but it will happen.
Yes.
And I think the example, Post-its is a perfect example, which was based on the fact that at 3M they were trying to develop a stronger adhesive. It turned out that the people working on that came up with a much weaker adhesive. They didn't know what to do with a weak adhesive. If adhesives were glue, what do you want to do with a weak adhesive? And it took them a while to figure out that there must be a use for it, and it happened. It so happened that one of the people who turned out to be the inventor was singing. Do you know the story? He was singing in a choir, and he had a hymnal where he had to look at his hymnal, and he had to figure out where they were going to sing. In other words, you have to mark places in the hymnal where he was going to do some singing. And the way he found out the places was he took a piece of paper and cut it into a number of different strips and put the strips inside the hymnal and put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on there. And as he was singing one day, he said, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a way to put some paper that you can put in there and you can pull off rather than having these strips. And that was the birth of Post-it.
Wow. So indirectly, the church has had something to do with innovation in our society.
Now you learned something there.
Absolutely. I did not know about the choral part in the church choir part, but that's fascinating. And like as we've said, you can't count on it, but it does happen. It will happen. And that's the amazing thing that I find that we need to be open to that, because that's part of the process of change as well. But one other element that we'll talk about before we wrap things up here, and I can't thank you enough for how much time that you have already given us, but I wanted to talk about this, and this maybe ties more into what we talked about earlier in terms of our educational system. But there are those who, such as yourself, who have, so to speak, the creative mind. I'm trying to remember if it's the left or the right brain that's the creative part.
I think the left, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but it's this whole aspect of ingenuity. Um, I find it, and the best example I can use is of musicians who they have their favorite musicians that they listened to as they were growing up and so forth. And then they start to create their own music, and all of the sudden, the group or the band or the individual that they used to listen to hears their song and says, "Wait a minute, that's something that was in one of my songs. I'm going to have to sue this person to get royalties, and to so on and so forth." And I often think, wait a minute, why are you upset? You should be flattered that they remembered and just put that in, and it wasn't intentional, it wasn't malicious, it was because they listened to what you produced. And the same thing kind of happens in the material world in terms of different inventions and innovations and so forth, that someone will take two separate items and they'll put them together to make something, in a manner of speaking, new. That to me is sort of innovation as well. Um, is
Well,
that
that of course is why the patent system was created, right?
right? Right. But do you think that because I don't know what your philosophical bent is, but it says somewhere in the Bible it says that there is nothing new under the sun, nothing. And as I said before, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, what difference does it make whether you use the feet the good Lord gave you, or you jump on an animal to get you to that point B, or when the car came along, you use that, or a plane, or a train, or a boat, or maybe a high-speed rail, or hopefully one day a transporter. I mean, we can only hope, we can only dream. It's all for the same purpose of getting from point A to point B. And it seems, and again, I'm not arguing the whole issue of the patent office by any means, but at the same time, I'm thinking, we don't own this stuff. We're just tools. We're just being allowed to create using what we have around us,
Well, look,
and so
I
forth.
think, if I can interrupt for a moment,
Sure, go ahead.
I think you're providing a tremendous service, in my opinion, by emphasizing and sponsoring thinking about the fact that people should not take things for granted. They should question what they do, and not only necessarily to invent something, but in order to see whether not just if there's a better way to do things, but whether this thing should be done at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are, and that's, I guess it's called out of the box thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really necessary to have such and such a gadget when there are some negatives to it? And if it could be eliminated, maybe humanity would be better off. I don't think people think that way, and there probably are a number of areas where that is definitely the case.
Would you say that that comes under the category of learning how to what they call critically think?
I think that sounds about right. I hadn't heard that expression exactly. But listen, I've really enjoyed this discussion tremendously, and you've gotten me to think about some things. So
Well,
I
let
think,
me first of all let me thank you. Yes, we're definitely going to wrap things up here. I want to thank you for the time you've given us here and things to think about as well, because that's how we come up with some of these innovations. We share ideas, and again, as I said before, I am beholden to thousands, or if I want to go back further, millions. If it weren't for Marconi or even the European guy who actually invented the radio. Marconi just got to the patent office first, from what I understand. But I thank you. This has been a real pleasure. And I do have three final questions that I would like to ask you, if I may,
sure.
that I ask all of my guests. Before I do that, I want to thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story. New paradigms for a new world, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays from 7 a.m. and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Monday mornings at 1 a.m. Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Special edition of Tell Me Your Story. And then Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m. following the news. And we stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. We also podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and YouTube, where you can watch these conversations. I hope you'll subscribe. And also select or click on the notification so that when I post a new conversation, such as this one, that you will be notified and you can tune in. And we hope that you will do that. We also hope that you can support us financially with whatever you can. We'll take energetic support as well, but we have a PayPal account for the financial aspect, and it's there for your security as well as ours. Put Richard at richarddugan.com in the email field when they ask you, to whom are you sending? And we thank you for all of the support you have given us and that you will give us.
Well, you can
And then,
certainly count on me.
I beg your pardon?
You can count on me because this has been very educational, and rather excited about the fact that we've had this conversation.
As I too. Finally, I just want to let you, the listener, know that we ask you to participate in the Decade of Perfect Vision, the 2020s, where we ask you to go within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place where you might find some innovation. You just never know. And listen to that still small voice of inspiration and encouragement and education and insight. And we hope that you'll do that. And with all that being said, we now move to the final portion of our program. Short little segment here we call the three final questions to our guest. And the first of those three is to you, Peter. Who is Peter Spitz?
Well, I'm a very lucky person because I was born in Austria, which was eventually taken over by Hitler when I was 12 years old, became a refugee in the United States, was very lucky to escape with my parents, and then had a series of good things happen, a very good education, a short period in the army, and then my rest of my education and my career. And what I became is a person very interested in technology, a person who wanted to be involved in technology in terms of my professional career, as well as creating a family and having a wonderful life. And I feel I'm very, very lucky with very good genes. I was able to achieve many of the things I wanted to achieve in life, and I'm still around here talking about it.
Second question is, what gets you up in the morning?
Well, what gets me up in the morning is the fact that if I don't get up, I'm not going to get rid of these aches and pains that a person my age is subjected to. So I get up, do a little exercise, have some coffee, take my medicines, and I feel like a different man than I did when I first jumped out of bed. So what gets me up is the fact that I'm able to make myself into the kind of walking and talking person that I'd like to be.
Final question. And again, thank you so much. The question is, what was your best day?
What comes to mind is the fact that when I was working for Standard Oil, New Jersey, just out of MIT, and after a year or so working in a refinery, a couple of us were sent to England to start up another refinery near Southampton. You're going to wonder what I'm going to say. So what happened was, here I was in England. I was about 23, 24 years old, doing a wonderful job over there. But I had to leave behind the girl that I met just before I left. It's been about a year getting to know her. And so when I got to England and I was there doing work, but missing her, and I decided to call her up from a little town called Hythe near Southampton, and she was at home. She picked up the telephone, and I asked her whether she wanted to marry me, and she said yes.
Ah, it's a beautiful story. Once again, Peter Spitz, thank you once again for joining us here on the program. Oh, I should mention that your website for people to find out more about you, as well as the book that we're talking about here, is peterspitzbooks.com. That's PeterSpitzBooks.com. We will be linked to your website on the podcast and videocast so that folks can find out more about you. And once again, thank you so much for sharing with us about reflecting on history, how the Industrial Revolution created our way of life. Thank you
And I
again.
have to thank you for the interview and for mentioning my book. And I think this has been a really worthwhile experience for me. So thank you again.
And I thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal. Jeanette, I am still listening. Dad, continue to be happy because I am.
Good.
Smokey, thank you so much. And I'll see you on the other side. And to my dear friend Zorro, aho.
Absolutely.
Aho.